Welcome everybody on this rainy night. Hi. My name is Kristen Moon and I'm the new president of Alexandria Historical Society. I want to thank you all for coming out on this quirky weather evening for our fall kickoff event. Okay, Jeffery T. Sammons is a professor of history at NYU, where he has taught since 1989. He earned his BA in history from Rutgers, followed by a master's at Tufts University in 1974, and after that became an assistant to the president at Lincoln University, before receiving a Whitney M. Young Memorial Fellowship for Leadership Potential in 1975. Is it okay? Okay. With that fellowship and other funding, he was able to go on to earn a PhD in American history at UNC Chapel Hill in 1982. From there, he took a position at the University of Houston, where he wrote his first book, Beyond the Ring: The Role of Boxing in American Society. A few years later, he began work on Harlem's Rattlers with his colleague, John H. Morrow, and with grants from many organizations, but particularly the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and History and the NEH. In addition, he is also a history advisor to the World War I Centennial Commission and a member of its Medal Review Task Force. He also serves on New York City's World War I Centennial Committee. Sammons continues to expand his scholarship on members of the 15th and 369th and all African American soldiers of World War I to advocate for their proper recognition and remembrance. And without further ado, please welcome Dr. Sammons.
Thank you, Ms. Moon. And thank you for attending tonight and braving the stormy weather. Actually, I teach stormy weather, and I don't know if you might not have made this connection, but that regiment marching in New York with Bill Bojangles Robinson as Bill Williamson in the film, and Dooley Brown as Gabe, is about the 15th New York National Guard 369th Regiment from World War I. All right. I'd like to thank, in particular, Miss Audrey Davis, who invited me to speak. My first contact from Alexandria was Mr. Bill Dickinson, who I believe is a past president of the Alexandria Historical Society. And I'd like to thank Kristen Moon, the new president, and all those organizations that were mentioned and the board members who helped to organize and sponsor this program. So before I get to that, let me do some local homage, I think. That's important because I'm not going to do much with that, if anything, after this discussion. But downstairs, there's in the museum, the exhibit on World War I. There is a treatment of Private William Thomas. Thomas is from Alexandria. Was a laborer for the Washington and Southern Railway before the war, and registered for the draft on June 5th, 1917, which was right up against the draft deadline, so I wonder what that means, whether he found out late or he was holding out until the last possible moment. He identified himself as Ethiopian on his draft card, probably he saw that as a more dignified identity marker than colored or Negro, and Negro with lowercase n at the time. Private Thomas was in the 155th Depot Brigade, which is stationed at Camp Lee in Petersburg, Virginia. and they were shipped overseas in March of 1918, and there he joined the 369th Infantry, the regiment that we're going to learn more about tonight. He was killed in action September 28, 1918, in the assault on Seychelles, and is buried in the Merce Argonne Cemetery. And according to Mr. Dickinson, he was not recognized at home for obvious reasons, but there was a long, recognition of him in the form of the name of the Black American Legion post, which has since been, in fact, for a long time, disbanded. He lived on Gibbon Street and was married to, and there's a discrepancy here, a record that I saw indicated it was May Y. Thomas, others May Coleman Thomas. In any event, that's something about William Thomas. I wish I had more information on other African-American Alexandrians in the 369th Regiment. I don't. The service cards for Virginia soldiers were lost. There are 15,000 veteran survey forms available, and this friend of mine, Rich Walling, a crack independent researcher, has looked into some of these surveys forms and came up with one from the same camp, Camp Lee, of a Percy Alexander Fitzgerald of Blackstone, Virginia, who joined the 369th in May of 1918 and went over without essentially any training. Fortunately for him, he was not thrust into combat as Mr. Thomas was, but served in the supply company of the 369th, and once again was in the 155 Depot Brigade, which is a service organization. We have to understand that there were only about 40,000 black combat soldiers in World War I out of some 400,000 black soldiers in the American military. And many of those 400,000 never even went overseas. They were used in labor camps at home, and many compare them to, forced labor camps within the American military. All right, so that's something about Virginia, and now I'm going to give you a history of this regiment that these men served in and how that unit came about. So we have this commemorative history that was presented to Colonel Benjamin O. Davis. Does that ring a bell? Okay. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. Was the first black general in the American Army. It happened in 1940. He had served in the Philippines. Don't remember active duty in World War I, but Davis came to the regiment in 1938 as its first black commanding officer, and we'll get to that story in a minute. So Davis was regular Army and assigned to this National Guard unit, which is strange. He also oversaw the transformation of the regiment in 1938-39 from an infantry regiment to a coastal anti-aircraft artillery unit. And this is because the War Department or Defense Department told Davis and the governor of New York that if you want these guys to fight, they're not going to fight as infantry. They have to take on this new role. So let's look at this in some detail. So we see at the top American flag and New York State flag, and also the ribbons indicating battles that the 369th engaged in. And of course, the most famous is the Merce Argonne, and that's where William Thomas was killed in September, early October 1928, and specifically the assault on Seychelles. All right, so you notice that this is the 15th New York Colored Infantry. So that's just not a designation or a title. I call it a speech act because it indicates that this unit was never really an organic part of the 27th National Guard, which was the New York National Guard that became the 6th. I'm sorry, the opposite was the 6th and then the 27th in World War I. In fact, they did not go over seas with the 27th Division, were shipped out earlier. They wanted to be attached to the 27th. The 27th wouldn't take them. And so they asked to be included in the famous Rainbow Division, of which he wasn't a general then, but Colonel Douglas MacArthur was a part. And the answer to their request to be included in the Rainbow Division, which included units from all over the country, hence the name Rainbow, was that black was not a color of the rainbow. And my co-author is fond of saying, and neither is white. But in any event, these guys would go over to Europe by themselves, essentially, used as laborers, stevedores, ditch diggers, road builders, track layers, etc., unloading ships, and having been trained as combatants, they begged to be sent to the front. But there was no one to put them with. They weren't going to be put with white units. So pressure from the French finally prevailed on General John J. Blackjack Pershing to allow the 369th to become a part of the French Fourth Army and the 161st and 16th Divisions. And that's why you see that this is the first unit that ever of the United States military that becomes an integral part of a foreign army. So let's back up a bit. Let's say something about the origins of the 15th New York National Guard. And this also ought to make Alexandrians feel good, all right? Because we in the North always want to pin racism on the South, all right? Well, I'm sure many of you saw Lincoln, right, and about the 13th Amendment. Well, the staunchest opponent of the 13th Amendment in that film was Fernando Wood, a congressman from New York, and also a mayor of New York, but a member of a Democratic sort of faction known as the Copperhead Democrats, who were pro-Confederacy. All right, so let me say something about New York's history. All right. In and I'm going to skip the slave riot of 1712 and the 1741, in which blacks were executed, burned at the stake, impaled in public, etc., and tell you that in 1790, New York City had more slaves than any other city in the United States, with the exception of Charleston, South Carolina, and didn't really get rid of slavery until well into the 1800s because it had this gradual emancipation law. All right? New York was heavily implicated in the slave trade and the trading of goods, manufactured goods, to the South for raw materials from the South. So there are economic reasons, as well as racial reasons, for New York's sympathy with the South. In the Civil War, There were 3 black regiments from New York, but they were not recognized by the state of New York. They were raised and sponsored by the Union League Club of New York, so they were privately supported. When Frederick Douglass made his call to colored men to arms, he made it from New York, but he said the path to becoming a soldier in the United States Army was not through New York, it was through Massachusetts. And that is where we have the 54th Massachusetts and the 55th Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass was mentioned to me earlier, and of course he's across the river in Anacostia and doing good things still, by the way. He said, he had 2 sons in the 54th Regiment, and said that unless blacks fought and died for freedom, they wouldn't gain the benefits of it. They wouldn't be seen worthy of it. He told Abraham Lincoln that he was fighting the South with a strong black arm tied behind his back, right? But New York wasn't interested in recognizing a black National Guard or militia unit at the time. It's not until 1893 that a black teacher is allowed to teach in an integrated school in New York City. 1893. And that woman, Susan Elizabeth Frazier, becomes the president of the Women's Auxiliary of the 15th New York National Guard. New York City does not get its first black policeman until 1911, Samuel J. Battle. And he was on that force alone for quite some time. Blacks do not have elected officials in New York into the 20th century. So in 1910, there's an organization that comes into existence called the Equity Congress of Greater New York. And its purpose is to increase black presence in civic matters in the city. It wants black elected officials, wants to improve black businesses. It wants black representation on the police force and in the fire department. But it also wants a black National Guard unit recognized by the state of New York. And it has a model, and the model is in Illinois. And that model is the 8th Illinois Regiment, which has been in existence since the 1870s. It is a unit that is officered from the top down by blacks. All right. So in 1910, this man from Ohio who had served in the Ohio National Guard, and he has a Washington, D.C. relationship, he fought in the Spanish-American War. Oh, by the way, do you know there was something known as colored immunes in the Spanish-American War? There was this belief that blacks were immune from tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria, and black soldiers were used as nurses for those who had contracted the disease, and of course many blacks died of these tropical diseases of which they were supposedly immune. And this man, Charles Ward Fillmore, was one of those who contracted the disease but survived. So he goes to New York because he knows they want to establish this National Guard unit. He's tight with one of Booker T. Washington's men, Charles Anderson, who's the collector of customs or whatever in New York City. And Fillmore organizes in 1911 a colored provisional regiment. So there's pressure brought to bear on elected officials in New York State to recognize this regiment as a National Guard unit. Fillmore goes to the commander of the New York National Guard, General John F. O'Ryan, and says, my men want to be in the New York National Guard. We have to recognize that that National Guard units are not only military organizations, they're also social organizations, right? So there's no way that these folks at this point in time are going to have blacks on the same social plane, especially black officers with white officers. So he told Fillmore that his men could serve in the sanitation corps, be auxiliaries, and quartermaster. It's all kinds of service operations. And he said, your guys will be happy with the fancy uniforms. And Fillmore responded, my men are not interested in fancy uniforms. They're interested in positions of honor and trust. So Fillmore kept fighting. He's getting hammered by the Republicans as well as the Democrats on this black regiment issue locally, as well as the Militia Bureau in Washington. So it becomes a real political football that the Democrats, Tammany Hall in particular, the regular Democrats in New York, use against the Republicans. So finally, an anti-Tammany Democrat in 1913, the governor, William Sulzer, signs legislation authorizing, remember this date, 1913, authorizing the establishment of a black National Guard unit in New York. And it's supposed to happen within 3 months of the signing of that legislation. All right? So what happens? The National Guard unit says there's a law, but we got things that can beat the law. And what they did was to fail almost every man who took the officers' examination. And without officers, there weren't going to be these units, right? So this continued. And Fillmore keeps this provisional unit together through all these difficulties. And I credit him with being the father of this 15th New York National Guard when it finally happens. And it happens for some funny reason. One, by 1916, all right, so it's still not a recognized unit by the state of New York as late as 1916. We have World War I raging for 2 years now, and also Republicans are pressing, and I saw the treatment of Woodrow Wilson. He kept us out of war and then he took us in. And of course, he's a Democrat, but the Republicans are really gung-ho entering the war in 1916. But there's something that happens on the Mexican border, and you wouldn't think that this, would have any bearing on what happens in New York State. But there's a man by the name of Francisco Pancho Villa, and he's given Americans fits on the border with Mexico. So there's this pursuit of Pancho Villa that includes John J. Pershing, Colonel Charles Young is involved. And by the way, many people wanted Colonel Charles Young to become the commander of this regiment. And many New York National Guardsmen are sent, as well as other National Guard units, sent to the border to pursue Pancho Villa. There's a Republican governor of New York, elected in 1914 by the name of Charles Seymour Whitman. Whitman was once the secretary of the Union League Club. Remember that Union League Club and the raising of those 3 black units? Also protected, and I forgot to mention, the draft riots of 1863 in which blacks were massacred in New York City, and many of those who survived got out of there because they knew that New York was an unsafe place for blacks. All right? So Whitman is now the governor of New York, and he had been told by the War Department that there was a surplus of infantry, so they couldn't add any African-American unit to the New York National Guard. He had tried before. He wanted to make that law a reality. But with all the New York National Guardsmen on the Mexican border, there was no longer a surplus of infantry in the New York National Guard. That gave Whitman the opening he wanted, and he then authorized the establishment of the 15th New York National Guard, May 30th, 1916. Well, everything is not as it seems. There had to be a grand bargain struck with the Militia Bureau and also with the leadership of the New York National Guard. And remember what I told you, that Benjamin O. Davis was the first black commander of the 15th New York National Guard, and it didn't happen until 1938. Well, one of the compromises that had to be made was that the unit had to have a white commander, all right? And in fact, General Orion believed that there would be no black officers in the unit, that they would all fail the new enhanced federal test for National Guard officers. Well, Whitman picked his buddy from Nebraska, who had been in the Nebraska National Guard. His father had been a senator from Nebraska, Leland Hayward. Some interesting connections here with the Haywards, by the way. In any event, Hayward had worked for Whitman when Whitman was the city attorney. He became his public works commissioner, and he appointed Hayward as the commander of the 15th New York National Guard. Now, my co-author and I say that if there had to be a white man to lead this unit, Hayward proved to be the right man for the job, who truly believed that merit was what determined, treatment of someone, and also treated people on the basis of what their capacity was as opposed to what their identity was. So, there are blacks who pass the officer exam, and when they're ready to go overseas in 1917, 5 black officers go over. And I also ought to mention that they go over in a hurry because of what happens in Spartanburg, South Carolina, involving Noble Sissel, who was a member of the famous Noble Sissel. You might identify him with U.B. Blake, but Noble Sissel was a drum major in the 15th New York National Guard, and very close to James Reese York, who was born in Mobile, Alabama, but who grew up in Washington, D.C. So Sissel had gone into this hotel to get a newspaper for James Reese Yorp, and the hotel proprietor kicked Cecil out into the street. A riot almost ensued, and there was a determination to get these guys overseas as quickly as possible before they start a race riot here. And we have to remember what happened in Houston, Texas, with the 24th Regiment earlier in 1917. So as I indicated before, the unit goes over. It's placed with the French in March of 1918. In 1 month, they're on the front. And in May of 1918, one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of the American Army takes place. And it involves Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, who are mentioned in the this commemorative, this history. So Henry Johnson from Albany, New York, originally from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Needham Roberts, who I think had just turned 17 at the time, from Trenton, New Jersey, are at a listening post. And I also forgot to mention the rattlesnake. I'll get back to that. There's Burt Williams, who was briefly with the 15th as a recruiting agent, basically. And of course, there's Charles Young. But in any event, Henry Johnson, and there we see Henry and Needham. These are imposters of Henry and Needham. Henry had lots of imposters, by the way. And there's Henry. So, and I'll show you something else, a representation of Henry. So they're at this outpost listening for a German raiding party. And they got what they were listening for. So around midnight of May 14th, 1918, there's a barrage of gunfire and grenades, and the German raiding party gets into the outpost. Needham Roberts is throwing grenades. He had been hit early, largely incapacitated. He's being carried off by Germans. Henry Johnson sees him, jumps on top of the German with a bolo knife, plunges the bolo knife through the German's skull. Fights off maybe as many as 20 to 24 German soldiers with a rifle, with the butt of his rifle, with his bolo knife, and they believe that he killed 4, and the rest ran off. And Henry Johnson would be awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm, which is by order of the Army. It's the highest level of that award. Would be promoted to the rank of sergeant, but would not receive an American honor until 1994, the Purple Heart. Then in 2003, he received a Distinguished Service Cross. And many people saw that as a cynical move to undermine the campaign for the Medal of Honor that was ongoing for Henry Johnson since 1988, or maybe even earlier. So it's not until 2015, June 2nd, 2015, and I attended the ceremony, that Henry Johnson received the Medal of Honor and became the second African-American soldier from World War I to be so honored. The first was Freddie Stowers in 1991 with the 371st Regiment from South Carolina. And I'm involved in a project currently that is with the United States World War I Centennial Commission that is trying to get the Defense Department to authorize a study to do a systematic review of minority soldiers who have been denied proper recognition in World War I. There's never been a systematic review for World War I. There's been a review for World War II, in fact, a few reviews, and for wars after World War II. I want I mentioned, here's Hayward, by the way, and that's Hayward up there, but Hayward in the middle, and first to reach the Rhine. And they actually crossed and occupied the Rhine. Over here, second from the right, is William Butler, who's from White Plains, Maryland, and that's where he was born, but spent most of his life in Salisbury, Maryland. And he is someone we're looking very closely at for Medal of Honor consideration. And let me say something briefly about what he did. There was a German raiding party, once again, that actually had captured, and remember, there was never a man captured in this regiment, so this is really important stuff. And you not only capture men, you capture intelligence when you do that. You also break morale if you're able to get into your enemy's lines and take men and information with you. So this is very important, what Henry Johnson did and what William Butler did. William Butler's lieutenant was captured, and so were, a number of men. Butler communicated with his officer about what kind of move to make next to deal with this German raiding party. He picked up a Shosha, which is a French machine gun that is designed to be shot prone, right? It is notoriously inaccurate from distance. Butler got 2 men to feed the belt of ammunition into this automatic weapon and ran through the trench and killed numerous Germans without injuring his own men or his officer. As it turned out, George Robb, who was a white lieutenant in the regiment and received the Medal of Honor, the only one from the 369th, had a record that indicated that William Butler had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, but was given the Distinguished Service Cross instead. And Robb maintains that what Butler did was extraordinary and the epitome of what a soldier should do under intense, pressure. And praised him to the high heavens. All right, so, by the way, let me go back to this. Okay, so there's Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., shortly before he becomes first black general, and his successor is Colonel Chauncey Hooper. Hooper served with the regiment in World War I, so he had come up with it, and he will lead them in World War II, in Hawaii, and in the Pacific. All right, so we have this interesting poem. It features the 15th New York National Guard in the middle by Andy Razaf. He also has another one called Don't Tread on Me, which uses the symbol of the Rattler, which I should speak to because many people call this unit the Harlem Hellfighters. They did not call themselves the Harlem Hellfighters. The American press called them that, and then when it came to recording music, Pathé Records called the band the Harlem Hellfighters Band, and it stuck. But they called themselves the Rattlers. This happened in March or April of 1918, in which they adopted the Rattler symbol, which goes back to the Revolutionary War, and the notion of don't tread on me and the Gadsden flag. In Flanders fields where poppies blow beneath the crosses row on row, we blacks an endless vigil keep, yet we though dead can never sleep. Ingratitude has made it so. Why are we here? Why do we go from loving homes that need us so? Was it for naught we gave our lives on Flanders field? Ye blacks who live, to you we throw the torch, be yours to face the foe. At home and ever hold it high, fight for the things for which we die, that we may sleep where poppies grow in Flanders fields. And Andy Razoff, by the way, worked very closely with Fats Waller, so there's another link to stormy weather. So Razoff sees in the black soldier the new Negro and a torchbearer of democracy, as it were. So that's a riff on John McCrae's famous poem, In Flanders Fields. All right, there's that. Remember what Henry Johnson looked like? Well, that's Henry Johnson as rendered by William A. Rogers, and the Battle of Henry Johnson, and this looming, hulking figure, he called them two first-class Americans. The Chicago Defender renamed that cartoon rendering two real Americans. So what I want to do is to, okay. Oh, yes, by the way, so Henry Johnson, you see that cartoon, he was the first real infantry combat hero of the war, white or black. Pershing was forced to recognize him or acknowledge him, and Needham Roberts, but especially Johnson in communiques, cablegrams, etc., but nonetheless still didn't really honor him. So this says, Henry Johnson licked a dozen Germans. How many stamps have you licked? So this is for the Liberty Stamp or the Liberty Bond campaign to raise money for the war. So it gives you some sense of, and this is in Albany, how popular Henry Johnson was. All right, so you think we can get this? I don't know if I can make this move. All right, so this is footage of the parade of February 17th, 1919, and that's where we see the film Stormy Weather start okay, so let me get out of your way. And it's no sound. That's a French formation, 16 across, never seen in United States military. And look at that discipline. You should see how it was represented in the New York press, though. Ridicule or all seeing them as looming, threatening giants, and a concern about once they've seen Paris, would they ever, go back to the farm, right? Al Smith. The film begins with the regiment marching in the film, and Bill Williamson is supposed to have been a member of the regiment in the band, but there's a hero the brother of Selena Rogers, who is played by Lena Horne, is killed and was a hero in the 15th New York National Guard. So that's the connection. Okay, here's the man of the hour. Well, a little premature. Here we are. That is Henry Johnson. So that looming All right, so I'm going to end the presentation with a statement from Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson was a man of few words, and much has been sort of projected onto him, but I think this gives us some sense of what Henry Johnson was about. He was a survivor. He was crafty, in war and out. But in 1927, September 7th, Henry Johnson was down on his luck. He was not well. He wrote Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who had written a book about the 369th, the black soldier in World War I, and it featured Henry Johnson. And Henry wrote, "Esteemed Sir, I am writing to say that I sincerely appreciate the article you had published in the paper concerning me and the way I fought to help protect this country during her struggle with Germany. But I'm very sorry to state that I don't think my Uncle Sam is treating me just right, as my pension has been reduced to $60 per month. I have a sick wife, a weakened body, and my health is gone, thus making it utterly impossible for me to work. How am I to make it in this life? The odds are all against me. Nevertheless, I'm no slacker. This I have demonstrated to all. I have endured the hardships of battle during the war and have fought hard, and I'm doing the same in peace. I shall be grateful to you if you will only attend to this matter for me, for I cannot manage to get along. Very respectfully yours, William H. Sargent Johnson." Now, Henry was illiterate, so he had someone write this for him, but I can, state that it probably reflects his sentiment at the time. 2 years later, actually less than 2 years later, July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died in Washington, D.C., and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Thank you very much. I'm willing to entertain some questions. Yes, ma'am.
This month's Smithsonian does a whole piece on the French section of World War I, and they say that these colored soldiers had no training, military training whatsoever before they were joined to the French. Is that possible?
Well, the 369 certainly had training. Now, there's two parts to this, because the 15th New York National Guard was trained as a combat unit, but it only had about 2,000 men when it went over. A division in World War I had to be around 3,000, actually 3,700 when you put in all the kinds of units that were necessary. So it would have a lot of replacements and probably lots of soldiers who had not been trained. But the French didn't think the Americans were trained. period, regardless of color, and they were right. So, and then when the, Pershing decides that he wanted to wait until 1919 before launching an offensive, but, conditions, forced him into earlier action, and so they were sending raw guys over, but we weren't used to modern warfare. And, it's weapons of mass destruction. It's trench warfare. Pershing was a marksman guy and also an open warfare guy. So the French and the British didn't believe that we knew how to fight this kind of war at all. And look, they had been fighting it since 1914. So it's not surprising that the French would say that they were largely untrained. But they had the unit for a month before it went to the front, which is not a long time, but they had also been trained in combat before. Yes, sir.
One of the distinctions they list is the only all-volunteer regiment. That ignores the United States Marine Corps, which was pretty much the evidence there. They were always all volunteer.
Okay, let me go back to see if we can see what it says. I don't know much about the Marines, except they didn't want black people. Okay, so where do you see that?
Right under Family's first, only volunteer regiment made for the war, which got to France. And that's only indicating.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed it out. I think that is, I don't know exactly what they're saying here, but there are many National Guard units, and they would be considered, volunteers. And in fact, some from this area, the 372nd, was made up of National Guard, various National Guard units, and one of them was a battalion from Washington, D.C., that Woodrow Wilson called out to guard the White House. So he didn't want any hyphenated Americans guarding the White House. So he felt that the most loyal Americans were black Americans, and they were the most trustworthy to guard White. So you pointed out an inaccuracy there for sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What were those three shipwrecks mentioned?
Oh, first time the engine blew, so they had to return. Next time there was a fire aboard, they had to return. The third time they ran into another ship, and they said they weren't returning, so they fixed it en route and went on to York. But those problems with not being able to go overseas actually almost blew the regiment up, because they were at Camp Merritt in Tenafly, New Jersey. The guys are bored stiff. They're mistreated by, other soldiers from other places. There's a murder in the regiment, which I didn't talk about, with this Valdo Shida, and there were lots of, absent without leave situations, and it looked really bad for the regiment, and finally they were able to get over. So, yes?
Professor, I appreciate your presentation. It was enlightening and connected some dots for me. But I would like to, thank you. I would like to ask you perhaps three questions. We'll wrap in one. The 371 Regiment in World War I and the 371 Regiment in World War II, the one that Jackie Robinson was involved with, they had the Panthers insignia that for World War I. Can you confirm that for me?
No, I can't.
And then,
Well, I don't know about the 371st in World War II, and I forget exactly what unit Jackie was identified with. And I don't know about the Panther. Yeah, okay.
and the other thing with Charles Young School, Charles Young Elementary School is on Benning Road next to the Langston Golf Course, just for your information. It's a great elementary school. you mentioned that you were going to do some research in reference to trying to get them, the brothers some Medal of Honor. You'll be doing the research at the St. Louis, the one, were their records kept at St. Louis and was burned out during the fire of St. Louis?
The personnel, military personnel records are housed in St. Louis. And in 1973, I believe it was, there was a fire that destroyed 80% of the records, which is it's a tragedy of immense proportion for the memory of individuals, but also for historians trying to, tell the true story of.
Going to the VA now?
Oh, the VA is that's where you get the claims, the pension records, and you see the dysfunctionality of the VA if you try to get those records as well. Some of which are at the National Archives in St. Louis. If the case was closed before a certain date, those records are supposed to be there, no claims upon them. After a certain date, they're there, but that's a mess. Yeah.
How are you going to validate?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there are records that, like award cards. I was talking to Allison earlier about these burial death records, last pay records. But it's, I have found documents in fact, let me say this, that there was a search, an investigation done in 1988, because it was to look into whether Henry Johnson was deserving of the Medal of Honor. And that's when Freddie Stowers' file was discovered, and I put that in air quotes. Along with the file of Burton Holmes from the 371st, who also was nominated for a Medal of Honor. That team that did that investigation indicated that there were 2 other black soldiers who had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, but they don't name them. I know they know who they are, and I can't figure out why they're not named. And so this team says that Burton Holmes and the other 2 had been properly vetted and processed, but Freddie Stowers' file for some reason had not been. So they recommended Freddie Stowers for the Medal of Honor, and he received it in 1990. They declared that Henry Johnson, who had not been nominated for a Medal of Honor as far as I can tell, was not deserving. Now, we have to understand something. Henry Johnson did his thing in May, which is very early. In fact, only 4 men by the end of the war had been given the Medal of Honor. There was a review done in 1919, and then another somewhere around 80 plus or 90 then received the Medal of Honor. But I've discovered that William Butler had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, and I wonder if he's one of those they don't name. And then there's another one, Van Horton, from Alabama, from Athens, Alabama, not Athens, Georgia, for the 366 was nominated for the Medal of Honor. Then Mitch Yockelson, who is a friend of Allison's and mine, found that 3 members of the 370th, which had been the 4 members of the 370th, formerly the 8th Illinois, had been nominated for the Medal of Honor. So at least 8 African Americans in World War I had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, and each and every one of them denied, except for Freddie Stowers, who they said wasn't processed. Right. Yeah.
You mentioned September the 28th for William Thomas.
Right.
Also, Alexandria had another gentleman that died on the same day, African American, by the name of Chris Clockton. And I just wanted to put that on the floor.
Well, send me the information on him, because I'll do some more research. And I don't know if there are, any Alexandrians who received a Croix de Guerre, which, I'd like to be able to provide to you, et cetera. But I had not heard that name before. Thank you. Yes, in fact,
Yes, I thought there was a white officer in the 369th that went on to become a congressman.
oh, yes, so that's Hamilton Fish. Hamilton Fish was a 13-term congressman, a dire enemy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They had been childhood friends, but they felt that Franklin had abandoned or betrayed the class, and he turned against Roosevelt. It was Martin, Barton, and Fish who were who Roosevelt fingered as his prime enemies in Congress. But he was a captain in the regiment, commanded Company K, where James Reese Yorp and Noble Sissel were, and became one of the great friends of the black soldier after the war. Many people mistake him as the commander of the regiment because he's so prominent in its association with African American soldiers, and is instrumental in the establishment of the 369th Veterans Association with Charles Rangel. But his son, Hamilton Fish IV, was a congressman in the 60s and 70s, another 13-term congressman. He's the one that sponsored the legislation for the establishment of this 369th Veterans Association. Yeah, well, yeah, I didn't. One of the things that the 369th wanted was a monument after the war, and Fish was involved, and Pershing set a limit on who could have a monument, and the limit was at the division level. All right, so this is a regiment, so there are 4 regiments in a division. So he said no regiment can have, because there's proliferation of monuments, we can't keep them up, etc. So there's a monument in Psalm P that has all these divisions on it, including the 93rd. I call it a monument to hypocrisy because it also has the 42nd Division on it, which is the Rainbow Division. So they're on the same monument as the 93rd Division. And I didn't mention that the 93rd Division, of which the 369th, 370th, 371st, and 372nd were supposed to be members, was only a division on paper. It was a provisional division that never fought as such. Each one of those units was assigned to the French from the so-called 93rd Division. So there are all kinds of things wrong with it. So what do we have here? We have a privately raised monument. With the French and with Americans, this doesn't happen until 1997, and the American Battle Monuments Commission has nothing to do with it. It won't, engage in the upkeep of this monument. So that is not the monument that Fish wanted or was fighting for. That never happened. So I saw, I'm sorry, this lady, gentleman, and then you. Okay.
Did the soldiers from the regiment have any trouble getting a pension and getting one equal to what the white combat soldiers were getting? Because you mentioned in Johnson's letter that his pension has been reduced.
Okay, now I have to tell the truth. I wasn't going to say this, but I can't. You ask a question and I must answer honestly. The pension was supposed to be $100, right, a month. Henry Johnson's pension was reduced to $60 because his wife, who he said was dead, put a claim on it. Johnson married someone else without divorcing his wife. And Edna Georgia Jackson came out and said, I'm owed some of this pension. And that is why Henry's was, so I don't want you to go away and think that that they were racially discriminating against Henry on his pension when Henry was playing games. And remember, I gave you a little hint. I said that Henry was crafty, he was a survivor, the skills that served him in war served him in peace, okay? All right. So your perception brought something out that I was not going to admit. Yeah, so I was, okay. Yes, sir.
I believe from what I've read that African Americans' experience in World War II was a significant factor in the start of the Civil Rights Movement. So why don't you think the Civil Rights Movement could have started right after World War I?
I do. Absolutely. That's a very good question. World War I has been given short shrift in so many ways. World War I is a war that basically gave us the world we have today, for better or worse, right? It gave us weapons of mass destruction, like the world has never seen, right? It changed the map of the world in many ways that are not good. Medicine improved as a result of World War I, so there are positives. But also, blacks made their mark on a world stage in ways that they could not have were it not for World War I. And despite the fact that people like Robert Lee Bullard, a general, named for Robert E. Lee, denigrated, demeaned the black soldier after the war, others did as well. And in fact, it was formalized in an Army War College report of 1925 in which they impugned the courage of black soldiers, the intelligence, and especially of black officers. It's disgraceful, but the genie was out of the bottle. Blacks knew what they had done in World War I, and no matter what was said about them, they weren't going backward, right? So we see that blacks are involved in soldiers in the race riot of 1919 in Chicago. They're not going to be massacred as other blacks had been. We saw what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What is it? The Greenwood section of Tulsa in 1921. Black soldiers defended Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I maintain that and we see what Andy Razoff is saying about the new Negro that comes out of World War I. That World War II gets far too much credit for, the civil rights movement. There's a lot of foundation laid in World War I for that. I think there was one more person who had a question. Last question, thank you.
Related to his, can you talk a little bit about how black soldiers were treated in France by the French as compared to how they were treated by U.S. soldiers?
Right. The regiment was lucky to be placed with the French. The French, look, the French weren't without racism, and they treated their African colonial soldiers terribly and used them as shock troops. But they saw these black American soldiers as cosmopolitan, as more American than black in some ways, and there was far less, discrimination and poor treatment of black soldiers than we saw in the American Army, especially in the 92nd Division, or with black soldiers who didn't fight. Allison has done a lot of work on the, tell me that, the Graves, what's the name of the service?
Oh, the Graves Registration Service.
Blacks, that's probably the worst possible job that you could have, the Graves registration, where you had to dig up bodies and identify them, right? Or prepare them to be put into, either sent home or put into an American cemetery abroad. There's a famous memorandum, the Leonard Memorandum, which Leonard was a colonel in the French army who was attached, he was a liaison officer to the American Expeditionary Force headquarters. And it appears that he was forced to write this memorandum about how black, the white soldier, the French soldiers should treat blacks in a certain kind of way so that they don't spoil them when they go back home. And of course, Pershing got the 369th out of occupied territory as quickly as possible for fear of too much close contact and friendly relations between black soldiers and French people, and especially French women. And one of the things that was said about black soldiers was that they were rapists. And there's no evidence of this. And of course, we know the relationship between charges of rape and lynching, but there's no evidence that blacks were engaged in any kind of depredation of French women. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Remind everyone that there are still books downstairs for purchase, and if you want Dr. Sammons to sign it, he's available as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.